Have you ever been out birding and spotted something so unusual that you did a double take? Maybe it was a bird you've never seen before or one that didn't even belong in the area. Well, that's exactly what we're talking about in this week's question of the week. What are some of the most unusual birds that we've seen in our own region of New England? So, Dustin, let's start with the basics. What makes a bird what I would call unusual in the context of our New England region? Are we talking about birds that are just rare, or is there more to it than that?
Birds can be rare, but they're never random. Remember that, we'll come back to it. Birds mainly end up in weird places for three reasons. They become unusual because they're far outside of their normal range, but rarely in a habitat that does not suit them. So these types of vagrants fall into three categories. First one is birds that wander off course during migration. We call them vagrants. Storm-driven birds are ones that are moved out by weather or hurricanes, for example. Some birds are known to sort of be disrupted by northeasters all the time. The third one is escaped exotics, birds that got discovered and were thought to be weird, but turns out they just wandered off of a farm or something like that. These sights are exciting because they're unpredictable, but remember, they might be rare, but they're not random.
Got it. Okay. So, with that said, we've got the setup. Now let's talk about the part that I think is really interesting. Can you give us some examples of unusual birds that you're aware of that have been spotted in New England over the years?
Absolutely. And this year actually was a pretty good year. So most of the ones we're going to talk about were nearby in Massachusetts or around this year.
No kidding.
Yes. So the first one is the pink-footed goose. This is a rare visitor from Greenland or Iceland. It sometimes gets mixed up with other flocks, especially when it arrives here. So you'll see them mixed in with, say, Canada geese. So keep your eyes open for them. They're smaller, a little different coloring, and they have distinctive pink feet. This is also the rare goose that one of the characters in the movie A Big Year was looking for at the end to get over the hump. I believe it was Jack Black.
Too bad he wasn't here in New England.
I've birded with that gentleman that played Jack Black in the movie, actually.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. Next up is a fork-tailed flycatcher, not to be confused with the scissor-tailed flycatcher, which lives in Texas and extreme southern Florida. But a fork-tailed flycatcher comes from the Caribbean and can wander all the way up to Canada, but often get blown in from southern South America and occasionally wanders north. They have a long forked tail and do some aerial acrobatics that make their flight such a striking sight to see. Most of those sightings occur in late summer or fall because they get off track, partly blown by storms and partly just their migration sense goes a little haywire. Next up is a rufous hummingbird. Here in the east, we basically have one breeding hummingbird, just the ruby-throated hummingbird. But in the fall, it's very common. Actually, there's often 5 or 10 or more discovered rufous hummingbirds in the Northeast because they somehow, instead of flying south like they're supposed to, they accidentally fly east first before they start flying south. So we end up seeing some rufous hummingbirds at feeders around New England almost every year.
And you brought this up in last week's episode 11 of the vodcast, when we were talking about how animals use Earth's magnetic field for their navigation. This was one of the animals that used as an example that can sometimes get a little disoriented.
That's right. And it makes it worthwhile to leave your hummingbird nectar feeder up longer than you think in the fall. Even when your ruby-throateds are gone by September 15th or certainly by October 1st, leave it up for a couple extra weeks. The nights are cold, your nectar doesn't spoil at those temperatures, and you might just get a vagrant right outside your window.
Okay. What else do you got for us?
Next up is a northern lapwing. This is a European bird that somehow wanders across the Atlantic Ocean occasionally when it's blown off course. They have a crested head. They almost look like a killdeer that we're pretty familiar with, but with the crest of, say, a cardinal on top. So it looks unlike any other shorebird that we have in the Northeast. So these are historically rare, but sightings have increased in recent years, maybe due to rising ocean temperatures. And then lastly, in late 2021 into early 2022, you'll recall we went and chased a Steller's sea eagle. This was by far the rarest, most publicized vagrant maybe that ever visited New England. So the Steller's sea eagle is a bird that wandered. It's not unusual for it to wander from Russia and northern, sort of north of Japan, over into the Aleutian Islands and Alaska. They routinely interact with bald eagles up there. But in the winter of 2020, you remember the Texas grid went down because they had massive ice storms down in Texas. For some reason, whether it was that storm or just this bird blown crazy off course, it went from northern Alaska down to Texas, and it was spotted there, and birders lost their minds over it. And then later in the year, it showed up in the days before Christmas in Massachusetts. And then by New Year's, it was up in southern Maine and has since moved into Newfoundland, but it's been living successfully among the bald eagles in Newfoundland ever since.
I'm glad to hear that. I was curious about what happened to that bird. I will say that situation when we went to go look for this bird, you would have thought Taylor Swift had landed in Boothbay Harbor because there were just people running amok with cameras everywhere. Cars, like it was like the biggest fangirl scene I have ever seen outside of like accidentally ending up in an urban area when a celebrity's coming through, because I'm not a crowd person, so I'm not fangirling, but boy, man, that was wild.
Yeah, there was some Booth Bay paparazzi for sure.
Okay, so you mentioned that all of these unusual birds fall into a few categories at the start of this segment. Can you kind of like, how did they get here? Can you go into a little bit more details for us on that?
Sure, it could be any one of these factors or a combination of them interplaying with one another. But weather patterns play a strong factor. Sometimes if there's a hurricane, the heavy winds, everyone knows about the eye of the hurricane where it's calm in the middle. Well, sometimes birds that ended up in the calm middle because they didn't want to fly into the storm get trapped in that eye and they move with the hurricane.
Oh, no.
And then when the hurricane breaks up, say when it gets maybe north of the Carolinas, right? So you might get a bird from Cuba that got pulled up north of the Carolinas. When the hurricane finally breaks up, that bird suddenly is like not in Kansas anymore, not in Cuba anymore.
That poor bird.
Right. Other storms like nor'easters and hurricanes will also push birds, say, northward or eastward. This happens a lot with the northern lapwings. If they get caught up in a nor'easter over the Atlantic, it kind of pushes them up. And so they'll stay ahead of the leading edge and get pushed where the storm is pushing them, not so much trapped in the inside like the first example. But then they also have navigation errors. Young birds, they don't have experience migrating. They might take a wrong turn. Their internal magnetometer might be a little bit misaligned, so it's pointing them in the wrong direction. Or if they encountered a magnetic field disruption like we talked about last week in episode 11. And it requires a little bit of experience. And if they don't have the experience, when they get off course, they just don't know it, and they end up where they end up. Next is climate change. We've got some shifting temperatures, shifting weather patterns, and shifting ocean temperatures that are moving the food sources around. So if they're moving after a food source and those food sources aren't in the same place, they might be used to, flying west until they get to the large school of herring or something. But if that school's not there, they just keep flying west until they find themselves in the wrong spot. And then the last one is eruptions. We've talked about these a little bit before, where birds just end up moving south in large numbers. These are rather regular. If not every year, there's sort of routine that they do move when they're in need of either to spread out because there's been a large population explosion where they're from and they need to spread out in order to make the local food source last for them, or there's a particularly bad food year, like if the voles are low or something in their home, then they move down, or seed crops, particularly in the boreal forest. So oftentimes, especially in winter, we get lots of vagrants with things like pine grosbeaks, evening grosbeaks, pine siskins, red crossbills, white-winged crossbills, those sorts of things, because they're spreading out looking for food. The same thing happened sort of this year where we had hardly any cedar waxwings and Bohemian waxwings around New England because we had a super dry summer. The berries on the multiflora rose and the other native plants were sort of like all dried up and not very good. The cedar waxwings took off. So someone else is experiencing more cedar waxwings than they're used to, and we don't really have any this winter.
This reminds me, and you're going to be very proud of me as the bird adjacent one in the relationship, but you brought up in a previous episode, I can't remember which one, but an eruption taking place in I think you said Michigan with the great gray owls, and there being more of those that ended up down in Michigan because of food scarcity.
Yeah, this year was a big eruption year for them. Probably, I think I was talking about Minnesota, but it probably happened in the upper peninsula of Michigan as well, where those birds are typically up in Canada, but they're coming down mainly to either separate themselves from other owls in such food competition for mice and voles, or that the food situation up north wasn't great for whatever reason, so they came down.
Okay. All right. So I'm glad that we opened up the conversation through some of this discussion, especially about eruptions, to include more than just the US. So we're talking about New England, but we're really doing it as an example for any of you listening in other parts of the country to understand that, like, there's always going to be an opportunity to potentially see an unusual bird in your area. And so that's my little segue into talking to you about if our viewers watching want to spot an unusual bird in the course of their birding or bird watching, how do you go about that? Like, how did you know that that Steller's sea eagle was a big deal, unusual opportunity in our area? How do you find that information as a birder? And I'm also going to add in, are there certain areas where that's more likely to happen? From kind of an ecosystem standpoint, are there certain times of year where that's more likely to happen? What should people look for?
This comes to so a couple years ago, I went to a lecture by the famous ornithologist, David Allen Sibley. Sibley's birds is in our background right there. Um, and he said as part of his lecture, when you see a rare bird, know that it's rare, but it's not random. Even when a bird ends up outside of its usual range, it really needs the habitat that it's adapted to. You can't get a desert bird living for very long on the seacoast. You can't get a marshland wetlands bird living for very long successfully in, an arid climate, right? The other way around. So it's important to know that when stuff happens and birds get out of place, yes, it's rare that they ended up here, but it's not random where they end up.
Got it.
And some of those birds that wander also wander repeatedly to the same places. So there's been a few birds that have been known to come up to Cape Cod, and even though they are rare and it's the only one of that species that it's escaping me for the moment, it'll come to me, I hope. Maybe we can pop it in later. But it's come back every single year for like 15 years now. So there's new birders that have heard about this and want to go see that bird, and it shows up every year because it's just whatever its migrating malfunction is, it's happening routine. So rare, but not random, even in that example. So it's important to know where those hotspots are. So on the coastal areas, for example, in New England, there's Cape Cod at points like Race Point Beach, which is the northernmost tip of Cape Cod, Monomoy Island, and the Plum Island National Wildlife Refuge. And then there's some migration traps like headlands, peninsulas, and islands where birds get concentrated during migration. For example, Satchwest Point National Wildlife Refuge in Rhode Island is a great example of this. And there's a place in Pennsylvania called the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, where the topography of the land is sort of two mountain ranges that from north to south come together in a narrowing V. And so the migrating birds coming southward get funneled into that V, and they all fly low overhead if you're up at that sanctuary watching or doing a hawk count like we did last fall. Mm-hmm. And that means if there's a rare bird that's coming down, it's going to get funneled with all the other birds through that area. So you might have a good chance of finding them at a place like that. But then how to know about them? Well, use eBird to identify any rarities. Pay attention to the listservs or the Facebook groups or the different social media channels that have local birders talking about what's around, because sure enough, you'll hear, people like to, I don't want to say brag, but they like to broadcast what rarity they found. And if they saw it, you'll probably hear about it too. But get active in your birding community as well, right? There's local birding groups all over the place. Birding groups like the Brookline Bird Club in the Boston area, in our area. There's a group called the Boxborough Birders a few towns from us. Groups like that also have local email chains if something might not be super rare, but it's rare for your area. Those are great birds to get, especially for newer birders, who I think are some of our most popular listeners right now. And then lastly, for timing, right? Be a little bit more aware of it at the times of year when it's going to happen the most, particularly August to November. That migration pattern in the fall, that's when those first-time migrants are migrating, and that's a good time to find some rarities for sure. And of course, after any major snowstorms, storms in general, not just snowstorms. And don't be afraid to go birding when weather seems suboptimal for people. Just because it seems rainy and foggy doesn't mean the birds don't get a choice to not live in the habitat just because it happens to be rainy. They might be hunkered down, but oftentimes those are great conditions to see birds, including migrants that are here, unusually.
As you know, I love my trivia, especially about nature. It's honestly one of the ways that I get excited about nature. Um, any fun facts that you uncovered about unusual bird sightings when I told you that I wanted you to research this topic for this week's episode?
Yeah, the ones that stood out to me were in talking about the pink-footed goose. I learned they can fly over 1,500 miles nonstop in one go, and that's a huge distance for a large, heavy-bodied bird like a goose. We've talked about some really long migrants before, but that's a big feat for a relatively large bird. And then others like the fork-tailed flycatcher I mentioned, they're known for sort of incredible wandering abilities. They typically come from southern South America and might be spotted as far as northern Canada. So they're a good one to sort of keep in the back of your mind to try to get on your life list someday because it could happen. Now, listeners, I want to hear from you. Have you ever spotted an unusual bird in New England or elsewhere? What was it? Where did you see it? So drop us a comment and let us know.
That's all for today's episode. But before we head off on our next adventure, this is just a quick reminder that you can find Dustin's wildlife photography and links to all of our content channels on our website, hikeandhearth.com.
And we love being part of the YouTube nature lovers community. So keep sharing your comments on your experiences with nature, wildlife, and conservation. And if you're not already subscribed, be sure to join us.
Yes, and if you're on Substack, we just started our newsletter, Nature Notes with Hike and Hearth, so we can expand on some of the topics that we cover here on the vodcast. We have a whole bunch of other plans in mind for the Substack. We're having a great time on Notes, engaging with the nature community over there. It's a lot of fun. Subscribers are ramping up, so if you are on Substack, look us up and be sure to join us over there for deep dive summaries of our content. Okay, Dustin, are you ready to send us off for today?
I sure am. Until next time, friends, keep your eyes on the skies and your hearts in the wild.
Bye, everyone.